Sara is the president of OCAD U, the university that, and I see Sara in many different settings as executive heads, presidents. We see each other in many places, but I'm always impressed with her insightful and engaged approach to the issues we address there. So it's a real pleasure for me to be able to spend the evening with you to hear your talk. This is the first in a new series of lectures that celebrates the 40th anniversary of the Canadian Studies Department. And Sara will kick off the talk with her talk on reflecting Canadian cultural production. So the speaker series was thought through as a way to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Canadian Studies Department, but it does kick off, in a way, the 50th anniversary of the university, which begins in earnest next August. So 2014 to 2015 is our 50th anniversary, but next August, when we have our homecoming weekend, there's a series of events throughout this period between now and that August kickoff that will really launch the 50th anniversary. As all of you will know, Canadian Studies is really central to the mission of the university. It's part of the vision of the university from its founding. Its founding in 1964, and even before that, when there was the first series of planning sessions that brought about the university that we so love today. And this really, as I mentioned, is gearing up for the anniversary of the 50th, but it's the 40th of the department, and it does reflect, I think, the commitment that this university has to Canadian studies, a commitment that I think is rare across the country now. You don't see nearly as much celebration and understanding of Canadian studies as there perhaps was in those early days. So I certainly am looking forward to Sara's talk, and I would like to now turn to Dr. Brian Palmer, who will give a more formal introduction and say a few words about Canadian studies and Sara Diamond's talk. So thank you. Welcome, Sara.
First, I want to welcome all of you to this, the inaugural lecture in a series that has been developed to commemorate and celebrate the 40th anniversary of Canadian Studies at Trent University. Canadian Studies, along with Indigenous Studies and formerly called Native Studies, has been a central component of Trent's mission as a university founded in the 1960s, when these kinds of area studies really burst onto the scene. Trent's founding president, Tom Simons, had a vision of a university that would first and foremost address knowing ourselves, albeit doing so in a world increasingly defined by the realities of the long reach and realities of its global dimensions. Over the course of the last 4 decades, Canadian Studies at Trent has pioneered new interdisciplinary ways of approaching and understanding ourselves. It's moved into new ways of championing and developing wide-ranging scholarship and pedagogical excellence. Our department sustained for decades the Journal of Canadian Studies. We built and then partnered with Indigenous Studies to develop and maintain an MA program, and we helped to launch the first PhD program in Canadian Studies in the country, a joint venture with Trent and Carleton. And in spite of being a small academic unit, rarely with more than 6 departmental members, Canadian Studies at Trent boasts a number of distinguished faculty whose excellence has been acknowledged with Simons Teaching Awards and Distinguished University Research Awards. Our students have gone on to make fundamental contributions to Canadian society through their involvement in politics, scholarship, international development programs, the arts, and many other important and critical areas and activities. And at Trent, our resources are used routinely in Canadian Studies to support and sustain a number of academic endeavors which are outside of our immediate departmental bailiwick, as well as many community activities that contribute to the cultural and intellectual enrichment of Peterborough. So we are justly proud of our accomplishments over the course of our first 40 years, and we hope for another 40 of equally vigorous activity at Trent. And we hope to see you at future lectures and events this academic year, and as Stephen Franklin mentioned, throughout the many stimulating academic and other activities being organized to commemorate and celebrate Trent's important 50th anniversary. I think few speakers so well capture the interdisciplinarity and imaginative crossing of boundaries and rethinking of conventions that we rightly associate with Canadian studies, as does our speaker tonight, Sara Diamond. Her talk, I think, will provoke a discussion of Canadian artists, technology, science, and the bridge to research, and it will unfold, I'm sure, at the interface of the humanities and the social and physical sciences, blending together creatively the challenges and potential of crossover thought and blurring the seemingly hard, fast, and artificial lines of distinction between the real and the representational. Now, I like to think that the literary theorist and critic Frederick Jameson's injunction to always historicize guides almost all substantive thought and intellectual engagement. I'd like to think this, but I do know better. I'd also like to think that anything worth thinking through commences with appreciation of the fundamental importance of the analytic category and lived experience of class position in society. Again, it's my area. I'd like to think this, but I do actually know that there are often other things at stake, the class being complicated, as it always is, by other identities and by other aspects of history. That said, however, my inclinations, I think, are somewhat confirmed by the history of our distinguished speaker tonight, Sara Diamond. When I went to the west coast of Canada in 1981, taking up a teaching position at Simon Fraser University and beginning my life as a labor historian, I kept hearing about a woman by the name of Sara Diamond. Not only did I hear of Sara in academic circles, but in the netherworlds of the far left groups that I was prone to travel in, and I'll avoid mentioning them by name for fear of embarrassing Sara and maybe some of them. I also heard her name constantly mentioned. She had produced a much used bibliography on women in British Columbia, and her research on women's auxiliaries in the trade union movement was legendary and would actually shortly be published in what proved to be a pioneering collection of feminist essays published in BC. In collaboration with writers like Varda Burston, Sara would intervene in feminist debates around the representation of sexuality and taking difficult but very principled stands against censorship. The content of all of this work was at the time fresh, exciting, and timely, as in some senses I believe it still is to this very day. And these were, as Sara knows, very exciting and tumultuous times in British Columbia. There was a lot else going on. There was clamors about general strikes. There was a great deal of political opposition and mobilization. And people like us met in the streets as much as we did in classrooms. But Sara was also at this time challenging conventional methods of reconstituting the past. She was an early and trailblazing practitioner of oral history, when in some antediluvian circles of historical practice this was dismissed as rather peripheral. She was turning her research into the past into artistic video productions, fusing her study of history with new ways of representing this to a public, which she actually expanded with her work. While conventional labor historians like myself were mucking about in highly traditional ways, Sara was actually experimenting with new forms of art and new technologies that could be effectively used to promote understandings of the past and its class nature. While I was writing in journals like Label of Travail, Sara's intervention came in avant-garde publications like Fuse Magazine, Vanguard, Parallelogram, and Popular Studies Journal. Now, in this political and in this politicized artistic and cultural production, Sara drew also on her own experiences, and her first video in 1980, The Influences of My Mother, situates her mother photographically alongside the political struggles that she herself had been involved in. Indeed, it was just these kinds of struggles that had brought Sara to Canada in the 1950s, as her father and mother left the United States amidst Cold War McCarthyism. So Sara seemed to a recent arrival on the West Coast, such as myself in the early 1980s, something of an elder stateswoman, and really it's kind of astounding to think how young she actually was when she was doing all of this work and putting many of us to shame. She was in fact not even yet graduated from her Bachelor of Arts degree, which she would complete in history and communications. And again, there's that crossing of boundaries, that interdisciplinarity that we so value here at Trent. She was doing it at Simon Fraser in the 80s and completed that BA in 1990. And from there she would go on to complete a master's in performative new media arts in the United Kingdom, as well as a PhD in computing, IT, and engineering at the University of East London. So this really is kind of a Renaissance woman we have before us tonight. And her reputation deservedly soared as her stature as a video artist concerned with technology, gender bias, class position, and new media consolidated in these years. She also took committed steps to expand her engagement with Aboriginal communities, working diligently to provide information about new communication technologies, their potential for producing and disseminating First Nations artistic productions, and of also how they might be used by Indigenous activists. By the mid-1980s, Sara was experimenting also with the use of video paired with installations in her artistic work, and she was being showcased by the National Gallery of Canada, as well as by regional centers like the Vancouver Art Gallery. Teaching stints at the Emily Carr Institute of Art and Design at Capilano College and at the California Institute for the Arts, where she remains an adjunct professor, were coupled with an array of artistic productions and a compendium of writings, both popular and scholarly, with public lectures and with extensive service, which I really can't get into and even touch on a wide array of boards and advisory committees in the arts field. Before assuming the presidency of OCAD in 2005, perhaps the crowning achievement of Sara Diamond was the preeminent role she played in founding and leading the International Banff New Media Institute from 1995 to 2005. As the artistic director with media and visual arts at the Banff Center, Sara established research and commercialization summits that involved artists, designers, scientists, and personnel from industrial corporations. And the imaginative, exploratory, and path-breaking accomplishments of this intense decade of innovation has recently been chronicled in the magnificent collection Euphoria and Dystopia. I have to kind of bend to pick it up. The Banff New Media Institute Dialogues, which was edited by Sarah Cook and Sara Diamond and published in 2012. This is a sort of fundamental accomplishment of an immense achievement in a really creative decade of work. It's simply, I think, a cliche to note that all of this doesn't do justice to the productions and powerful impact of Sara. An artist, a scholar, an innovator, and a skilled administrator, Sara has led OCAD for 2 presidential terms, nurturing its transformation into a university, defending and stabilizing its traditional mandates, but securing immense infusions of financial support, including something I think on the order of $9 million for the Digital Futures program there. And all of this has expanded the curriculum and programs in ways that have changed OCAD's public persona and ensured its future leadership in specific areas of higher education in Ontario and in Canada as a whole. An Aboriginal visual cultural program has been launched at OCAD under her presidency and leadership, and OCAD is charting new fields of inquiry in the health and sustainable technologies areas. Since assuming her leadership role at OCAD, Sara has been honored, I think justly so, as one of Canada's 50 leading living artists by the Council for the Arts. She's been inducted into the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts. She's been awarded the prestigious Order of Ontario. And this year, most recently, she's been presented with the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal for significant contributions to Canadians. So it is our pleasure tonight to welcome her to Trent, to benefit from her insights, and to listen to her thoughts. I'd like to think that we owe it all to her own practice of historicizing in order to see the future, of beginning her illustrious career with the researches into aspects of working class life, and with the obvious empathy that Sara Diamond has long held for all those living within the grip of various oppressions. Sara Diamond.
President Franklin and Dr. Palmer, it's really a pleasure to be here. And I thought what would be perhaps interesting today would be to kind of walk through a bit of the history in Canada that brought together arts, technology, and science, and in some sense the institutional formations that brought it together, and then to talk about the Banff New Media Institute and some of what it tried to represent and accomplish. So there's really 2 fields that we're speaking about. One is euphemistically called art sci, or if you're in the UK, sci-art. And it brings together art practices and practitioners with scientists across a range of disciplines, and really interrogates both the philosophy of science and the philosophy of art, working from very different kinds of traditions across those 2 domains. And a component of that work has been focused in the digital space for sure for at least 3 decades. But now a lot of that work has moved into investigating ecology, sustainability, science that is very much looking at nanotechnologies, looking at the complexities of engineering, biotechnology, and the human body. And it has still a piece of it that's grounded within new media practices, but it's really a very wide scope. And it is an interesting set of practices because it has a component of avant-gardism where artists are consistently interested in what the great next technology will be, what spaces they can open up in terms of their practices that are not yet available, readily available to kind of off-the-shelf technologies. Art and technology is in some ways more of a narrow field. It sits very much next to new media art practices and has really been a large space, again, where artists have been really interested in emerging new media technologies and the ways that they could intervene into those. Both immersions within the technology itself, influencing what the technology would be, but also applying technologies into their own practices. So I'm going to talk through some of the ways that these spaces have been imagined, and then some of the interventions within the Canadian context. So there's been a number of really important artist-run centers, and I'll talk about those. And it's great to acknowledge Sue Dida here, who, of course, was the media curator at the National Gallery of Canada, as well as the head of Media Arts at Canada Council, and understands those spaces very well and helped to build them. In fact, some very interesting institutional histories in Canada, particularly the Film Board and National Research Council. And then the move to more formal institutional captures of those practices, as well as a number of networks, some of which exist to this day. So one of the very important initiatives in Canada was the coming together of the National Research Council and the National Film Board. And in a very visionary way, the concept of a studio laboratory, which really brings together opportunities for artists to be immersed in laboratory spaces, has been well described by Michael Sentry, who is a Canadian scholar currently living and working in the United States. And these were really threshold institutions that allowed experimentation with a lot of technological support for artists. So Xerox PARC, for example, was extremely important in that formation in the US. Bell Labs in the 1960s in New York State, in New York, where Robert Rauschenberg was, in residency and able to really play with Billy Kluver with a whole set of emerging technologies. And Canada, in some ways influenced by those dynamics in the US, but I would say quite autonomously because of the culture inside the NRC at that time. I mean, it was a relatively new agency, and it was committed to basic research as well as applied research, and the NRC, of course, is going through its own transformations now. And the Film Board was just a threshold environment. I mean, it was the animation center at a global level. People were playing with animation technologies. And these two environments came together in Montreal. And these were both English-speaking and French-speaking creators and researchers in the 1960s. And it really became a home for physicists and composers with a big focus on electrical engineering. And IMAX, so the actual IMAX technologies, were a direct result of this playfulness between computer scientists and electrical engineers and animators. And in the mid-1960s, there was a team of filmmakers and technicians who developed a unique multi-screen projection and camera system, and it was for the Labyrinth Pavilion, so for Expo 67. So of course, Expo 67 was a big driver of creativity, and artists are always very focused on making things that get out to the world. And so it became an engine really for some really amazingly creative work. And the technology was then commercialized. So as I walk through this, the other thing I'm looking at, which I'm really interested in, is research transfer. So how is it that this hotbed of creativity and activity actually can lead to products that are commercialized, and some of which then become available really at the global level. So very important to that process was a film that was entitled Hunger, which was released in 1973, and it used digital keyframe animation that was recognized immediately as an artistically convincing character animation. It was nominated for an Academy Award. It won numerous festival prizes. And at the Film Board during the mid-60s, another team of filmmakers and technicians had kind of set the framework for folds because of their work with IMAX. So the Film Board treated the end user as a creative artist, and they were really influenced by Norman McLaren, who's a fantastic Canadian animator. His philosophy that tools should be invisible, allowing the artist, and I quote, to handle personally the mechanisms that do remain, unquote. So using sort of constraints as an opportunity, which is a very exciting concept that artists and designers actually really like, and then facilitating improvisation. And so this is really a heuristic approach to technology invention, learning and inventing through practice-based research, through the necessity of making. And I think one of the ways that, interestingly, artists and scientists are drawn to each other is that it's an opportunity to really apply scientific research in a very concrete way, but a very experimental way. And artists learn through the process of making. So if you kind of bring those two practices together, there's many, many points of rupture between artists and scientists philosophically. But there's many points of congruence when it, when there's an opportunity to actually make something. So what's interesting is that, by 1970, the NRC had developed a system for keyframe interpolation, and then Hunger was conceived as a project that would push the technology, but it actually became a very successful film. So the other dynamic that's really important in the Canadian context is the strength of artist-run media centres. And through the auspices of the Canada Council, which really functioned as an organizing force, a number of centres both grew up within the Canadian context in a time, if you think about the 1960s, of, again, a great deal of experimentation with media, the emergence of television as a mass medium, and artists engaging with television in an extremely critical way, wanting to take control of the media, wanting to produce their own ways of understanding the world through portable video technology, and being critics of television on one hand, but also very much wanting to, in a sense, reverse the relationship of being spoken to by mass media and disseminating the opportunity for people to engage. So Intermedia was a real tour de force center in the 1960s, based in Vancouver, and it brought together experimental filmmakers, photographers, visual artists, and it had a very strong relationship with the university community in the Vancouver area. And the Western Front was one of the inheritors of Intermedia's experimentation. I'll go back to it in a moment. And 30 years ago, InterAccess, which still exists in Toronto and is quite a vibrant artist-run center, media center that is engaged with new technology and art and technology, less that art and science space, but very much art and technology emerged. And then Le Sat in Montreal, which is also very much a vital force there, began about 25 years ago. So artist-run centers were supported by the Canada Council. Media art centers were supported by the Canada Council. And this was one of the really important drivers in the Canadian context that's somewhat different from the US. In the US, what you see are a number of centers that emerge around cable television and access to cable. And that also was a dynamic in Canada. On the West Coast, I was part of an artist collective called Amelia Productions, and we used to, our slogan was that we were occupational video makers, and that whenever anyone would occupy the post office or a daycare center or Department of Indian Affairs or the telecommunications industry, we would be there with our cameras. So it wasn't a traditional occupational video. But in any case, so we were very much attached to Rogers and using Rogers technology, ironically somewhat, to produce these documentary media pieces. But in Toronto and other parts of Canada, there was more of an emergence of independent centers, and that access wasn't as necessary as it was in the U.S. So this is just an image from, really great image from the Intermedia Collective and artists across a number of disciplines. And Intermedia, and these are a number of, again, images from Intermedia work. So Intermedia got together with the Vancouver Art Gallery, which was a really amazing gallery at the time. Alvin Balkin was there, and it was really open to the public. It was overtaken by the spirit of the 1960s. And they mounted a show in the late 60s that was essentially experimental work by artists using various kinds of electronic technologies. And it was an abject failure in terms of most of the pieces actually really not working. But it got the most incredible reviews in the press because there was this fascination with the relationship between artists and emerging electronic technologies. And this is also a time, if we think back to the 1960s and we think about federal policy, it was a time when Canada was really, unlike the current era, very interested in using its artists as a kind of vanguard internationally to show how progressive Canada was, how engaged it was in technology invention and technology change. And artists were really the sort of avant-garde, in a way, the fifth column to bring industry into various kinds of international partnerships. So we're currently at a time when our government is really has retreated from that relationship with artists, and it has its absolute problems to think that artists become the force that becomes a sort of I guess pre-runner for industry. But certainly in the 1960s, artists benefited from this. But there was a kind of emperor's new clothes quality to the exhibitions because the technology and the art did not yet work. And in fact, over decades of experimentation, finally we begin to see technologies that are more user-friendly and able to support the kind of parameters that artists want to bring to them. But that relationship between experimentation and failure is actually one of the strengths, I would argue, in the art and technology and art and science space. And much like scientists are comfortable with failure and then trying again and then trying again, artists working in this space actually have been willing to, in a sense, live with failure until they're able to finally push a product to be successful. Some more work from the intermediate time. Interaccess, 30 years of new media exhibition and now technical training programs. And really, the way they see themselves is to expand the cultural space of technology. So to interrogate technologies, to try and bring artists to play within the space of technology in ways that are deconstructive, that help us understand what a technology is, but also to try and create beautiful experiences that are highly interactive. And just, again, a still from Interaccess and their recent exhibitions. And then Subtle Technologies is a very interesting festival that, again, has about a 20-year history in Toronto. And it looks at art and science, and it brings together scientists with artists in conversation to both produce ideas to create new projects, but also to look at collaborations. And their 2013 theme is immortality. So this idea of the archive and, again, now bringing back ideas of biotechnology and death and how we understand the kind of cultural space around the border between life and death, and exhibiting works that test those boundaries and also exploring popular culture. Very much worth going to, by the way. And so as we begin to move into the 80s and the 90s, I mean, this is really a period of intensive technological change. We see the transformation of what was known as new media, so the idea that anything digital was at the sort of edge of technology. And then we, of course, rode through what's described as first stage convergence. So this was telecommunications industries converging with content industries, and it sort of failed, in 2000, 2001, and now we're in what's described as second stage convergence. But there was this incredible bringing together of all of these technological streams, and of course, the level of innovation that allowed us to see constant progress, in a sense, in the efficiency of technologies. Globalization of digital tools, something that we were very interested in at Banff, was the kind of internationalization of what had begun as technologies that were primarily within Western culture, and their dissemination throughout the emerging world, and the ways that artists were beginning to engage in the kind of global context. And then these sort of notions of what it was to be human, that was in constant change and challenge within this context. So the idea that within cyberspace you would lose your identity, that gender, race, culture that you would bring into that context were no longer part of your apparatus, no longer part of your burden, and that we could create this utopian world. And of course that was highly debated and contested by feminists, by people who are racialized minorities. So we'll talk about that when we look at Banff and some of its fixations. Social media, which we tend to think of as primarily Facebook and Twitter, so a number of really mass media solutions. Well, social media has been emerging through the 1990s and has taken many, many forms, from chat to some amazing experimentation within the social media space. But it has transformed the way that we are in the world and how we communicate with each other. So that was one of the huge forces. E-learning is still an emerging change, but again, something that was contested and where artists engaged within that space to try and understand what it was, in fact, to bring knowledge online. And then collaboration, really moving away from our understandings of identity within the space of the internet to being far more collaborative, and the emergence of mobility, and now the internet of as Cisco calls it, the internet of everything. So machine-to-machine communication, which is really transforming the world that we live in. So these are all changes that are actually beginning to play out in the late 80s, the 90s, through this century. Certainly in laboratories, everything that's now on stream and popularly accessible, was happening in a lab somewhere. And this, of course, was of great interest to artists. And one of the spaces where there's been, again, coming out of the NFB, NRC, support of artists playing with engineering and technology has been Canada's incredible leadership in graphic software. And we tend to forget this because all of these companies now have been bought by large American multinationals. So Softimage went to Microsoft, et cetera, and then Alias Wavefront has now gone to Autodesk. So, but these were really made in Canada technologies that very much came out of that experimentation. This is work by Char Daisies. This is Osmos, really beautiful virtual reality piece that she created. Char's influence on Softimage as an artist was phenomenal because she was really interested in creating experiences that were extremely painterly. She came out of abstraction and experimental painting, and she forced Softimage as a graphic tool to be really responsive to the ways that she wanted to play in this space. She was one of the co-owners and founders, I think it's probably important to say. And so she had this tremendous influence on the technology. This is more of her work. And it became actually one of the reasons that Softimage became so successful. So we sort of see this stage of experimentation, happening in artist-run centers. We see these sort of early government-to-government connections, and then what begins to happen in the late 90s and the beginning of this century are formal opportunities for artists to kind of go back into laboratories, but this time with significant amounts of money and quite constrained timelines. And there was a very exciting residency program which was inspired really through particular people who were involved in the NRC at that time and the Canada Council and its sort of vision. And this program ran for only a couple of years. But it supported artists, for example, like Rafael Lozano-Hemmer, who is a Canadian-Mexican artist who's just a phenomenal artist and who builds technologies that really revolutionize the way that we use light and displays. And his work's highly politicized. This is a memorial piece that he made in the square in Mexico City to commemorate the generation of 1968 and the students who were murdered in the square. And to kind of bring them back, but using large displays. But also an output of Raphael's work is this, constant capacity for technology invention. Simon Fraser University Computed Arts Summer Intensive. This was one of the few university experiments in this period of time. And now you'll see how there's been a really, in a sense, a formal structure in the university sector in Canada that supports this kind of work. But Tom Calvert and Tekla Shiphorst and Samuel Ma were involved in the Graphics and Multimedia Research Lab, and they would have these intensives which would bring together artists and researchers from across the US and Canada to just play with technology. And one of the outcomes, and they were very interested in performance technologies, so in dance and in sound. And one of their projects was a piece of software called Lifeforms, which has since been commercialized by Credo Interactive. And the choreography with this technology was fantastic. There was a problem with it being able to represent gravity. So it would be used to plan choreographies which had no gravity. And the dancers would actually try and realize these dances. And it was one of the most phenomenal things I think I've ever seen in dance, because they really would push their bodies to like hover on walls. And the human body's amazing. And so they were able to take something that had really come from virtual space and transform the way that their bodies were in physical space. And it was a really interesting moment in that sort of cyborg impact on the body. But very much driven from this experimental, really creative context at Simon Fraser University. So Lifeforms, then became a system to support animation and being able to animate multiple human figures to compose in dance. And it had just begun as a means to supplement Laban notation in dance, and now it's a motion capture software, and it continues to be used. And Maurice Cunningham, as well as Tekla Shiphorst, were two of the choreographers who worked with it really consistently. And then Tekla took that software and moved it into building these large-scale, beautiful installation pieces that you could stroke, and they would respond in very choreographed ways. And again, really engage the body in a really erotic relationship with surface and space and image, and a very different way of thinking about new media that had been beginning to emerge in some of the other practices, which were kind of very cold and hard. And there's a theorist I really love a lot, a woman named Anna Cacolan, who's a French theorist who writes, she's an art critic and a theorist, and she talks about the importance of really keeping the human body foremost in the relationship with technology, and thinking about technologies being, these warm kind of living forces that we can transform from their cold sort of material roots. And I really like that way of thinking about the body, and Tekla and technology, and Tekla really embodies that work. So I will talk about the Banff Centre a little bit more extensively, but of great importance in terms of kind of marking a sort of boundary, in a sense, was the Art in Virtual Environments project. So this grew out of a 1990 residency, the bioapparatus, which was led by Catherine Richards, who's now at the University of Ottawa, and Nell Ten Hoff at York University now, Michael Sentry and Douglas MacLeod. And it was supported by the Department of Canadian Heritage and Interval Research. Interval was a lab that existed in the US, and it was a lot like Xerox PARC, except that it didn't really circulate its results. It was wholly funded by Paul Allen, who's one of the guys who started Microsoft. And he genuinely believed that it would produce inventions that would be commercialized. And he hired amazing artists and also a lot of ethnographers. So he really, it was a bit of a threshold practice to bring sociologists and ethnographers side by side with artists and engineers to really examine the production process and bring ethnography into that mix, which now is much more commonplace. But in any case, that was great because it was a practice that then was imported into Banff. And you know, that interface between social science and engineering and art practice and science. So, and some amazing work came out of the bioapparatus and then the Art in Virtual Environments project. A particularly important project was Inherent Rights, Vision Rights, that was created by Lawrence Paul Walker-Lupton, who's an artist who's works on the West Coast. And he created this piece which was one of the very, very early artist-driven virtual reality pieces, which tried to rethink what the longhouse would be within virtual space. And Lawrence is very funny, and he said at one point that virtual reality was the most primitive technology he'd ever encountered. And what he did, though, and again, this really pushed the software, and he was working with Alias Wavefront software at the time, is he created ghosts and figures that represented the myths, in the cosmology he was interested in, who hovered in the virtual space. And you weren't allowed to have proximity to them. You could only, you had to earn your proximity based on your relationship and knowledge of the myths. And you would have to move in a circle around the perimeter in the proper direction. And actually being able to do that computationally in 1990 and 1991 was just hellish. So again, you have this relationship with an artist who's asking for something where, again, the engineers are saying it's not possible, but they become inspired and then they actually figure out how to take the software to the next level. So really interesting how that technology interface gets always pushed to the next generation with artists. So Placeholder by Brenda Laurel, an amazing virtual reality piece that allowed you to actually have multiple players within the virtual space, which had never been done before, and to embed sonic information and retrieve it. So it created histories within virtual space. And in order to navigate this environment, which was the Banff area, you had to become a character and you had to actually physically move like that character. So we didn't build all of them, but Crow was fully interactive. And so to become the Crow, you actually, and move, you had to flap. You were encumbered with a virtual reality headset, and you actually had to flap your arms and learn the movement and navigate over the space. And one of the technologies that Brenda and her team developed was the very first 3D video imaging that could be used in a virtual reality, but also in projection space. So again, this sort of relationship between being able to work as an artist, but work very closely with an engineering team and push the technology. Another really great piece, Diana, Dancing with the Virtual Dervish. Diane Grondola is now at Simon Fraser University, and she's doing amazing work in virtual reality for healing and pain control and building spaces for people who suffer from extreme pain to be able to enter those spaces and meditate and manage their pain. So Banff, one of the projects, the attempts at the Banff Center that I was involved with Kellogg Booth, who's at UBC, was to apply for a National Center of Excellence in New Media Research. Michael Century made the first attempt. That was in 1996. It was perceived as being too driven by, inside the Canadian government, by Communications Canada at that time. Kelly and I went back and wrote a full NCE proposal, made it through the first stage, and then were essentially turned down, which I found very amusing because the review committee, which was the interdisciplinary committee, thought that there never would be a return on investment in digital media technology. So anyhow, we weren't funded, and the Department of Canadian Heritage, in an amazing gesture, actually stepped in and created the New Media Research Networks. And these were basically networks to the tune of $20 million a year that was dedicated to artists and technologists technology companies and scientists being able to collaborate together, and bringing together private sector funding that was in-kind funding. And this set the stage eventually for new national centers of excellence, which exist now, to be funded through the NCE program. But there were a couple of networks that I was involved in. I was a co-principal investigator on the MI-ABLE network, which was with Ron Macari out of Simon Fraser University and Joanna Brzezowska out of Concordia University, and it looked at wearable technology, so fashion and technology, medical wearable technology. We were working with some of the to try and invent, with the University of Alberta, for example, some of the very first bracelets that would balance, beautiful bracelets that you could wear that would analyze your balance and be able to indicate if an older person or somebody who had, had surgery or some kind of destabilizing intervention would fall or lose their balance, and would signal and alert people. But we were trying to create these technologies in ways that were really elegant for people to use. And Tekla Shiphurst comes back again on the scene with an amazing technology that works off of sensors, so breath sensors and touch sensors, and creates large-scale interaction. And then a series of garments that we built. This is Di Mainstone, who's a fantastic British designer who came to the Banff Centre and worked on building a whole series of garments that were able to respond to sensor systems running off of Wi-Fi networks and Bluetooth. So this particular dress is a dress that and this is actually at a fashion show, so it actually got picked up by the fashion industry to some extent. So this was a dress that would read your gestures and based on your gestures would play music through the headset that would either calm you or excite you. So you could program music that you wanted, and it memorized 8 different gestures, and you could use those gestures to basically choose the music that you wanted to hear. Another set of garments that were, again, sensor-based interaction, where whatever she would do would light up LEDs on his wearables and vice versa. So kind of playful little flirtation devices, and using a lot of kind of design methods and ethnographic research to try and understand what people were comfortable with in the wearable space. And obviously enough funding to have these large teams of engineers and artists and designers to just sort of play with the technology. Another network that was funded, another one where I was a co-principal investigator, the Mobile Digital Commons Network, that was really looking at how to bring together the emergence of GPS, mobile technologies, and so location-aware technologies, mobile and sensor systems. And we built a whole series of experiences in Montreal on the mountain. We created a mystery game there where you could discover the ghosts that were buried in the cemetery, and they would jump onto your phone, and then you had to exorcise them. It was scary and a lot of fun. And then a game that was built on teaching kids about the ecology of the mountain parks through a mobile phone game. Again, emerging technologies coming out of this space. Unlike this earlier period where you see companies like Softimage and others, we chose to work in the open software, open source space. So this is a shift in the culture in many ways, and artists are being, at this point in time, so we're looking at really the very early 21st century, drawn to open source as an environment that felt closer to how artists would want to work within technologies, which was, be able to share the inventions, share the work, and engage others. So we developed an authoring system, amongst other things. And these are, so this was one phase. And then NSERC, with the Canada Council, created a very important initiative which was meant to promote collaborations between artists and engineers. So this is interesting. So you can see how these activities that are centralized in very specific kinds of formations begin to move now into more formal granting councils. Eventually, the heritage networks make their way into the NCE programs. They make their way back into the NRC. And the NSERC Canada Council program existed for almost 10 years. It was shut down just last year. as NSERC began to sort of centralize and kind of clean away, in their words, because I challenged them about losing this program, anything that was perceived as a peripheral program in NSERC. So this was a real loss, because there was a lot of great collaboration that came out of this. And what we begin to see at the very same time is an interesting transition to universities as a sort of site in Canada for this experimentation. So, this is also a phenomenon in the US and in Europe to some extent, and in Australia. So we begin to see this activity, which was on the periphery in many ways. Banff was think of a large artist-run center, certainly an established institution, but it wasn't a university. We begin to see more and more of this activity moving into the formal university setting. And OCAD University certainly is one of the places that's benefited through this. Brian mentioned the $9 million grant that we received from the Ontario government, which has been matched by Canada Foundation for Innovation and other funding. Hexagram was and is a really important center for this kind of collaboration. It really was a threshold in Canada. It brought together 74 researchers, began between Concordia and UQAM. It was essentially a shotgun marriage, because both Concordia and UQAM wanted to create university-based art and technology research centers, and the Quebec government at the time intervened and said, no, you have to do this together. And so they had a fairly rocky beginning of their romance. It took them about 3 or 4 years to really pull together that capacity. But side by side with Hexagram, the FQRSC in Quebec, which is their Humanities Social Science Research Council, began to create this amazing granting environment that was focused on research creation and really supporting artists who were in the university environment being able to produce absolutely major work. So I gave you some examples of people, and Xia Jinwei is a Canada Research Chair at Concordia who works a lot in immersive spaces with physical interaction, using various kinds of Internet of Things stuff, smart garments, props, intelligent architecture. Bill Bourne, who's an amazing Canadian artist who works in robotics and has been obsessed for very many years with, what is the personality of a robot? Like, these are inventions that we make as humans. So what's their affect? How do they function, within a sort of affective context? And Bill is supported by Concordia and has been. One of his great pieces, Hysterical Machines, very fun. His work is extremely scary and funny at the same time. And then Jason Lewis, an Indigenous artist, also at Concordia University, who came out of interval research. So he was hired, to bring both his work, which has been a lot in intelligent text and graffiti software, and then was deeply impacted in Canada and actually at the Banff Centre by Indigenous cultural practices, and sort of came out as an Indigenous artist because he had not had that identity, and has been very active now in building computer games and play within that use Indigenous legends and stories to engage both young people, but also in a way as a critique of the gaming world. Very closely related to Hexagram have been its attempts to try and commercialize its outputs. It's had a lot of failures in commercialization, but now it has an industry group that is both engaged with LaSatte, which is a large artist-run center, and with Hexagram, and their purpose is to try and, in a way, troll through what's happening in the labs at Hexagram and at LaSatte, and look at whether there's anything that they can take and then actually commercialize. So kind of more of an agency approach, rather than asking artists and scientists who are collaborating together to commercialize, saying, we're going to look at that environment and see what we can find from it, and a separate agency taking on that responsibility. This is just OCAD University, so our institute is 19 digital labs, and our philosophy is very much a sort of Gibbons Mode 2 way of looking at research and innovation, especially in the digital space, which is to think about these highly sort of interactive engagements where there's a lot of activity in our labs, and some of them are very close to potential commercial uses, and we try and work with companies who can, again, look in on what's happening and assist artists and technology researchers to take that technology to market, but without sort of interrupting the kind of creative practice that is underway. So really trying to support without disrupting a sort of virtual and virtuous circle of research. And just some images from our labs. We do a lot of work with Baycrest, and we've been working on what we describe as a scaffolding system for people with memory loss, both through accident and disease, and with first stage Alzheimer's. And again, this is bringing together the kind of affective or emotional interests of artists in looking at psychological and personal histories and ways of building memory devices that are highly personalized for people who are suffering from Alzheimer's. Another major, again, university-based project, this is with York University, OCAD University, and University of Toronto. And it's really a center that looks at data visualization, visual analytics, bringing very creative methods from art and design face-to-face with both business applications in visualization and scientific visualization to really question, what are the metaphors, how do we understand a visualization, what language do we bring to representing data, which we know is such an important driving force in the world that we look at. And then, interestingly enough, sort of coming full circle in many ways, the Heritage networks, eventually Heritage decided they were not in the research funding game, interestingly with conservative governments now in the lead. There was then another attempt to put together a National Center of Excellence that looked at graphics, animation, and new media with a very strong art and technology and design component of it. And it was in fact funded. So 50 researchers, $23 million, with both an industry and science and design and art-based leadership to it. So that project's underway. It's about to go up for renewal next year. In science, one can create work that both pushes the boundary of technology, but also, because artists are so engaged in this, ask critical questions about culture, society, technology, and the materials that you're using, solving problems through making, so that grounding in practice-based research. And then the outcomes that you see coming out of this environment are extremely multidisciplinary, and the research outcomes are not multidisciplinary. Their practices, their performances, their installations, their online experiences, but they're also theorized and represented in text form. And they try to really represent issues of cognition, of how we learn, how we know, and of embodied research. So, this period is an interesting one in Canada. It's highly collaborative. There is a very strongly self-reflexive quality in the Canadian context. Maybe it's the way Canadians tend to be to some extent. It's experimental. There's a lot of knowledge transfer. So there are technologies that emerge from this. Research is commercialized. It exists across Canada. I didn't talk so much about the prairies, and maybe that's a bit of an absence, but University of Regina, for example, has been amazingly involved in theater and performative technology development and in architecture. University of Manitoba, looking at three-dimensional space and architecture. And then this transition from informal formations and public labs, with the Simon Fraser University exception, to universities, with individual artists sort of enduring through this process and maintaining their dependency in artist-run centers, and artists being very involved in many ways in identifying new fields of research and innovation within the digital space. And it's not only technology that's coming out of this; it's actually digital representations. So I'm going to very quickly spend maybe 10 minutes or so on.
Sure.
How am I doing for time? How much?
You're okay.
Am I? Okay. So on Banff and the Banff experiment. So Banff really worked with three fields of convergence. So technology, the adoption of new media, and the economies of digital media. So, the premise was this idea that artists and designers should be advanced users of technology, but also, because of my Marxist background, which Brian shared with you, and I share with others, I came out of this very materialist analysis of technology. I've been very influenced by Bruno Latour and science and technology studies over the years, actor network theory, etc. And so I really built the Institute on that premise, that technologies are designed, that they're never neutral, that you have to kind of dig into them and understand them. And that part of what artists do really well is break technologies and kind of blow up their social implications really well. And because Banff was such a great site, it also was very much about the natural world. Lots of fun images. And Banff could play this role of kind of bringing people together because it was the mountains. And we really, the BNMI was really focused on this notion of utopia and dystopia, and was sort of ecstatic, belief in new technologies, but the dystopian other side. And we were really good at kind of moving back and forth between them. And you see me with various hair colors throughout this. So, and it was also this notion of a third space, which is something that I really embrace. So it's very much a sort of ethnographic notion. And Mark Mueller is a really interesting design ethnographer. And he talks about, he also, draws from Homi Bhabha, of course, but this notion of overlap or hybridity and bringing together these boundaries, and the boundaries being extremely productive. And everything I've described in that history comes from this sort of boundary riding space of artists and technology, scientists and artists working together. And we also had a material base, so we actually were able to facilitate artists creating new work and bring together technologists, technology researchers, and scientists and artists. So one of the premises also of Banff was play. So we ran a lot of programs that I'm going to very quickly describe them. They were riddled with games, lots of design challenges, people actually being out in nature together, and lots and lots of social activity. And for example, in this, we were trying to talk about interface design, so we blindfolded people, and others had to lead them around in nature and keep them alive and not get hurt. And it was very much about the sensory environment that you could discover through this process. So the summits were workshops, opportunities to bring together people, research centers, and we had this intellectual life that is captured in the book, where we really brought together, really in many ways, the meritocracy of the new media world. An infinite globalist, so I would go out and find people who are working and playing in this space from wherever they were in the world. They could be from the Philippines, they could be from Japan, they could be from former Eastern Europe, they could be from various countries and from Nigeria, and really bring people face to face with scientists who are also working at the global level to have these deep conversations about critical issues and this sort of space of invention and critique. And I'm just going to cycle through some of the really interesting work that was being done at the time in the new media space. So this is software that visualizes relationships on the internet, that kind of trolls them. And this is again early social media that was sort of mapping debates and looking at people's positioning. Artificial life prototypes that were used in genomic research that artists were developing with medical researchers. Interactive Screen was an opportunity to bring together new media artists and producers and companies to really look at their future together. And we had a kind of great following by people like Laurie Anderson, and people who are really at the threshold of using these technologies in amazing ways. Laurie Anderson created Puppet Motel, which was one of the first CD-ROMs that was ever really made as a creative piece of publishing work. And we did a lot of work with the Television Festival. I'm not going to dive into that context, but I was very interested in, what was happening within the disintermediation of traditional media by the digital revolution. It's taken a few decades for it to really heat up, but it certainly has. So we had a lot of provocative events, marriage or divorce, television and the web, for example, upset people in the television industry. That was a lot of fun. A lot of co-production work. So as I mentioned, great research labs, great support for artists actually producing new works and collaborations.
There's the
Yeah. So this is an amazing piece with David Rokeby and Tapio Makala, which is 2 saunas that were completely smart saunas that could communicate with each other across the globe, and would have this video software that would show the people in the sauna but kind of blur their bodies. And you could also record their sound, so you could have a sauna with somebody in Finland, essentially. And we had a very big focus on Indigenous artists, and absolutely making sure that they had access to these technologies. So before the concept of the digital divide, emerged, we had a very, very strong Indigenous program, Aboriginal Arts program, with a huge focus on access to new media tools, and a lot of workshops, work with communities, really bringing, for example, radio capacity through the Alberta Indigenous community, and then a series of very high-end labs funded by the federal government, Alberta, and various kinds of partners. And international activities, so lots of activities with partners around the world, and some really interesting partnerships like with the Descartes Biennale of Contemporary African Art, where we developed with the Biennale over a number of years a series of media labs that supported African artists from all over the continent learning digital skills and making new works together. And diversity was a big focus, as I mentioned, for us, questioning issues of identity and gender and race. And one of the most exciting events that we put together was with the MacArthur and Rockefeller Foundations, and we brought in 200 artists and scientists from all over the world to really talk about, how to rethink the notion of the studio lab to be a space that was really open to people from cultures that were just beginning to have access to this technology, and now have jumped ahead in many ways. So the book, and I'll quickly enter that. This is my colleague Sarah Cook, who's my co-editor. And what we tried to do was really use, and this is my historian training and my, I guess, oral history training. So we essentially taped absolutely, first taped, and then digitally recorded absolutely everything we did. And so we ended up with this phenomenal archive. And Sarah and I painstakingly went through the archive and edited the transcripts, and then solicited a number of kind of analytic articles that looked at the history and the trends and what we were really looking at as themes during that period of time, and that's what the book is made up of. So it's transcripts and commissioned essays, my desk working out. And I'll just run through the themes really quickly because I think they capture the fascinations of that era. So we were, before big data was popular, and before data has been really recognized in many ways as what it is, we were really deeply engaged with the problem of data at the Banff Center. So we saw it as a material. We were very interested in its nature, how it sat side by side with other concepts of memory, understanding the effects of data and metadata systems. And so there are a whole series of events that really look at data and are engaged with it. Physics, perception, and immersion. So the embodiment that I talked about was a very big theme at the Banff Center, and understanding visual perception and how it was changing and transforming, and how architecture as a term was in the process of transformation. The relationship between being human and the machine, so this relationship of the human and the mécanique, and the body again, and nature in the context of emerging technologies, artificial life, for example. This was a phenomenal event we ran on the Burgess Shale, and then brought in all of the scientists who are using Burgess as a kind of metaphor in artificial life, as well as artists who are working in that space. growing things. Eduardo Cock, who's a very interesting Brazilian artist who grew a bunny that was basically a fluorescent green bunny by messing around with its genetic strains. Really controversial work. And body maps, I've talked about Tekla a little bit. Social and individual identity, again referring back to this very long-term fascination with both individual and collaborative identities and how they're emerging in cyberspace, and the emergence of alternate cultures on the web, and problems, again, of race and identity within those spaces. We had an event called Skinning Our Tools that was really looking at how tools are culturally specific and almost racialized in how the user is imagined. Again, more work with Indigenous communities, money and law. So we really fought it out at Banff about the relationship between open source and copyright, and trying to understand all of the interventions that were happening, file sharing, versus proprietary ownership of content. Napster, of course. And then production and distribution, so we're really interested in how new media was being produced, how those models had changed, and then finally, we also produced a magazine with Heritage Canada, Horizon0.ca, still online, check it out. And those really were the things that we thought were, in a way, emblematic to this period of time, these sort of 2 decades of transformation in the online world. So, and again, I'll come back to Michael Century because he really started with this notion of the studio lab. So those were the people who supported the production of the book, and that's it. Thank you.